In 1962, a man who controlled an empire of violence, threats, and murder across Chicago was finally caught because of 563 frozen birds. This is the story of Joseph Aiuppa, a mobster who rose from a street bully to become the boss of one of America's most powerful crime families, only to have his rule ended by the most surprising evidence you could think of. Tonight we uncover the full story of Joey Aiuppa, the last of the gangsters from the Capone time, whose life reads like a masterclass in organized crime. Before we dive deep into Joey's world, I want to know, where are you watching from? What time is it where you are? Drop a comment below and let me know. Are you settling in for the night? Or maybe you're just curious about one of Chicago's most mysterious mob bosses. If you're enjoying this trip into the shadows of organized crime, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Give this video a like. It helps us bring you more amazing true crime stories like this one. And don't forget to share this with anyone who loves gangster history. Now let's step back in time to 1907. The winter of 1907 was very harsh in the Chicago area. Snow fell heavy and steady, covering the simple immigrant neighborhoods in a clean white that would quickly turn to gray slush under the boots of working men and the wheels of horse-drawn carts. In Melrose Park, a small town just west of Chicago itself, life moved at the speed of hard work and simple dreams. This was a world of factory whistles, church bells, and the constant sound of Italian languages spoken through narrow streets lined with simple wooden houses. It was into this world that Joseph John Aiuppa entered on December 1, 1907. His parents, Simone and Rosalia Aiuppa, had made the difficult trip from Lascari, a small town in the province of Palermo, Sicily, looking for the promise of America. That hard-to-find dream of wealth and chance that pulled millions across the Atlantic in those years. Like so many Sicilian immigrants, they brought with them their traditions, their distrust, their close family ties, and an old-world idea of loyalty, honor, and silence. Lascari, the town they left behind, sat on a hillside overlooking the Mediterranean Sea, a place where everyone knew everyone, where fights could last for generations, and where the ideas of omerta, the code of silence, and loyalty to your own community were not just words, but the very cloth of how society worked. These values, deep in the Sicilian mind, would travel with Simone and Rosalia across the ocean and be passed down to their son Joseph, shaping the man he would become in ways both deep and destructive. Melrose Park in the early 1900s was a mixing pot, though that term does not quite catch the truth of immigrant life in those days. It was more accurate to say it was a patchwork, separate communities living side by side. Italians with Italians, Irish with Irish, Poles with Poles. Each group keeping its own identity, its own social clubs, its own churches. The Aiuppa family settled into the Italian section, where the smell of fresh, baked bread and cooking tomato sauce mixed with the sharp smoke of nearby factories. Simone Aiuppa found work where he could, likely in one of the many factories that dotted the industrial area of western Chicago. The work was hard, the hours long, the pay small. Rosalia kept house, raised children, and kept the Italian traditions that connected their small community to the homeland they had left behind. It was a life of simple means, but not without dignity. The dignity of honest work, of family, of community. Young Joseph grew up in a home where Italian was spoken as often as English, where Sicilian traditions were kept with careful attention, where the values of family loyalty and taking care of yourself were taught from the youngest age. He was one of several children, though historical records are a bit thin on the full family setup. What is known is that the Aiuppa household, like most immigrant households of that time, was close, private, and deeply connected to the wider Sicilian community in Melrose Park and nearby areas. The streets where young Joey played were full of the energy of immigrant America. Kids from different backgrounds might fight sometimes, testing limits, setting up orders through the universal language of childhood competition and occasional fistfights. Italian kids, Irish kids, Polish kids, they all marked out their areas, their social ranks in the parks and alleys of these working-class neighborhoods. But under the surface of this immigrant mix, dark currents were starting to flow. The early 1900s saw the rise of organized crime among different immigrant groups. The Black Hand, Italian criminal elements who specialized in threats, worked in many Italian neighborhoods, preying on their own community through fear and violence. Business owners would get letters marked with a black handprint demanding payment for protection. Those who refused often found their shops burned or worse. This was the environment that shaped young Joseph Aiuppa, a world where official authority was viewed with suspicion, where the police were often corrupt or useless, where a man had to rely on his family and his community for protection and getting ahead. It was a world that taught its children that the official American dream was not meant for them. That success had to be carved out through strength, cleverness, and loyalty to your own. As Joey entered his teenage years in the 1920s, the scene of America was about to change dramatically on January 16, 1920. The 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution went into effect, banning the making, sale, and moving of alcoholic drinks. Prohibition, as it came to be known, was meant to reduce crime, corruption, and social problems. Instead, it created the greatest chance for organized crime in American history overnight. A huge demand for illegal alcohol created an underground economy worth billions. Criminal groups that had been small-time operations suddenly found themselves sitting on possible gold mines. The Italian, Irish, and Jewish gangs of Chicago saw a chance unlike any before. A chance to supply a product that millions of Americans wanted. Laws be damned in Chicago. This meant the rise of men like Johnny Torrio and his student, a young bully from Brooklyn named Alphonse Capone. The Chicago outfit, as it would come to be known, began gathering power, taking in smaller gangs, removing competition, and building an empire based on bootlegging, gambling, and prostitution. The roaring 20s were about to roar especially loud in the Windy City for a teenage Joey Aiuppa. Growing up in the shadow of Chicago during Prohibition, the pull of this world was strong. Why break your back in a factory for pennies when fortunes were being made on the streets? Why live in simple poverty when neighbors were suddenly driving fancy cars and wearing expensive suits? The gangsters of the time were not seen as criminals by many in the immigrant communities. They were seen as successful businessmen who had beaten the system, who had achieved the American dream on their own terms. But before Joey Aiuppa would enter the world of organized crime, he would first try to make his name in another arena where immigrant boys could prove themselves and maybe earn some money. The boxing ring. The 1920s were the golden age of boxing in America. The sport captured the public's imagination like few others, and fighters like Jack Dempsey became household names. In immigrant neighborhoods, boxing was more than fun. It was a possible ticket out of poverty. Young men who could handle themselves with their fists might turn that skill into prize money, maybe even a professional career. Joseph Aiuppa was no different to this dream. As a teenager and young man, he began training as a welterweight boxer, the welterweight division, for fighters between 140 and 147 pounds. Was competitive and popular. It required speed, skill, and stamina. Joey had the physical tools and the toughness that came from growing up on the streets of immigrant Chicago. But there was a problem in the boxing world of the 1920s. Not all fighters were seen as equal in the eyes of promoters and the public. Irish fighters were very popular, drawing bigger crowds and commanding higher pay. Italian fighters, still facing prejudice and stereotypes in American society, often struggled to get the same chances and paydays. So, Joseph Aiuppa made a calculated choice that said a lot about his practical nature. He took a ring name, Joey O'Brien, with this simple renaming. the son of Sicilian immigrants, changed himself, at least in the eyes of boxing fans, into an Irishman. Joey O'Brien could get fights that Joey Aiuppa might not. Joey O'Brien could earn better money. Joey O'Brien could climb the ladder that the boxing world had built, even if it meant hiding his true self. Imagine that for a moment. A young man barely out of his teens, already understanding the importance of how people see you, of playing roles, of showing the face that the world wanted to see while keeping his real self hidden. This ability to wear masks, to be whoever he needed to be for the situation, would serve him well in the decades to come. The boxing world of that time was rough, brutal, and often corrupt. Fights were held in smoke-filled arenas with bets placed by men in expensive suits sitting next to working-class fans who had scraped together their last dollars to see the action. The sport was heavily influenced by organized crime. Fighters were bought and sold, matches were fixed, and promising boxers often found themselves under the management of mob-connected people. Joey's career as Joey O'Brien was respectable. If not amazing, he fought as an amateur welterweight, learning to read opponents, to take punishment, to give it back efficiently. Boxing taught him discipline, strategic thinking, and perhaps most importantly, how to stay calm when someone was trying to hurt you. These lessons would prove very useful in his future career. But more important than the skills learned in the ring were the connections made outside of it. The boxing world brought Joey into contact with the sort of men who would shape his future. Promoters connected to organized crime, fellow fighters who also worked as muscle for various criminal businesses, bookmakers taking bets on the fights. All of these became part of Joey's growing network. It was through these boxing connections that Joey Aiuppa began his change from legal, if modest, sports efforts to the much more profitable world of organized crime. The exact moment of this change is lost to history, but by the mid to late 1920s, Joey had caught the attention of some very important people in the Chicago outfit. One name stands above all others in this changed time: Tony Accardo. Born Antonio Leonardo Accardo in 1906, just a year before Joey Aiuppa, Accardo would become one of the most powerful and successful mob bosses in American history. He would also become Joey Aiuppa's teacher, boss, and friend for life. Their relationship, built in the violent heat of Prohibition-era Chicago, would last decades and shape the path of organized crime in the Midwest. In the late 1920s, Tony Accardo was already making a name for himself as a bodyguard and enforcer for Al Capone. Capone, having taken over the Chicago outfit from Johnny Torrio in 1925, was building an empire of huge scope and violence. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre in 1929, where 7 members of the rival North Side Gang were shot down in a garage, showed the outfit's cruelty and Capone's willingness to remove competition through shocking violence. It was during this wild time that Joey Aiuppa entered the world from which he would never return. His boxing career, such as it was, faded into the background. Joey O'Brien hung up his gloves. Joseph Aiuppa, soldier in the Chicago outfit, stepped into the spotlight, though it was a spotlight that preferred the shadows. The late 1920s and early 1930s were a time of amazing violence and chance in Chicago's underworld. The city had become linked with gangland war, with competing groups fighting for control of the very profitable bootlegging trade. The Chicago outfit under Al Capone's leadership was the main force, but keeping that power needed constant watch, strategic thinking, and when needed, overwhelming violence. Joseph Aiuppa's entry into this world came through his job as a driver for Tony Accardo. This might sound like a lowly position, and in one way it was, but being a driver for a rising figure in the outfit was actually a job of great trust and chance. A driver saw everything, heard everything, and had to be completely reliable. The wrong word in the wrong place could get you killed. The right actions at the right times could get you noticed. Accardo was the perfect teacher for the young Aiuppa. Where Capone was showy and publicity hungry, Accardo understood the value of being careful. He dressed well but not flashily. He avoided public shows. He built relationships based on trust and proven skill. These lessons were not lost on his young driver, who soaked them up like a sponge. As Aiuppa drove Accardo to meetings, to collection spots, to sit-downs with other mob figures, he was getting an education in organized crime that no college could provide. He learned how the various operations worked, how beer was brewed in hidden places, how trucks avoided police checkpoints, how protection money was collected, how rival operations were taken in or removed. He learned about the importance of corrupting police and politicians, about keeping relationships with labor unions, about adding different criminal businesses beyond just bootlegging. But this education was not just theory. The Chicago outfit of this time expected its members to get their hands dirty. Violence was a basic tool of the trade, and those who could not or would not use it had no place in the organization. By the mid-1930s, Aiuppa had proven himself capable in this way. Records from 1935 named Joseph Aiuppa as a triggerman and expert bank robber working for Claude Maddox. This is a key detail that shows how far Aiuppa had risen in just a few years. Claude Maddox, born John Edward Maddox, was a big figure in the Chicago outfit, running operations in Cicero, the nearby suburb that had been a Capone stronghold since the early 1920s. For Maddox to trust Aiuppa as a triggerman, a term meaning a reliable killer, showed that Joey had proven his loyalty and skill in the most definite way possible. The talk of bank robbery is also important. While Prohibition-era gangsters are most linked with bootlegging, many also did traditional crimes like robbery. The early 1930s, during the Great Depression, saw a wave of amazing bank robberies across the Midwest by gangs like the Barker Karpus Gang, the Dillinger Gang, and others. These were not just crimes of chance. They were smart operations needing planning, teamwork, and nerve. Aiuppa's links to famous criminals of this time were wide. The document mentions connections with John Dillinger and the Karpus Gang, putting him in the circle of some of the most famous criminals in American history. John Dillinger, whose bank robbing spree in 1930 through 1934 made him public enemy number one, had connections to the Chicago outfit. When Dillinger was shot and killed by FBI agents outside the Biograph Theater in Chicago on July 22, 1934, it was reportedly after being betrayed by an outfit-connected woman, the Karpus Gang, led by Alvin "Creepy" Karpus and including members of the Barker family, was another major criminal group of the time. They specialized in bank robberies and kidnappings, and their operations often crossed with those of the Chicago outfit. The fact that Aiuppa had connections to these gangs suggests he was working at a fairly high level, trusted enough to work with outside criminal elements on joint projects. This time of the 1930s was shaping for Aiuppa in another way. It taught him about the dangers of publicity and federal attention. Dillinger's high profile, his appearance on the FBI's public enemy list, made him a marked man. He could not go anywhere without the risk of being recognized. His death at age 31 was a direct result of his fame. Other gangsters who sought the spotlight suffered similar fates. Al Capone himself was the best example. His swagger, his public statements, his expensive lifestyle, all of it made him a target. When the federal government could not make bootlegging charges stick, they got him on tax evasion on October 17, 1931. Capone was convicted and finally sentenced to 11 years in federal prison. He was moved to Alcatraz in 1934, and by the time he was let out in 1939, he was a shadow of his former self, his mind damaged by untreated syphilis. These clear lessons in the dangers of fame were not lost on the young Joseph Aiuppa. While some gangsters wanted recognition and respect, Joey was learning that the smartest operators were the ones nobody talked about, the ones who built their empires quietly, methodically, and without drawing federal attention. This way of thinking would guide him for the rest of his career. The repeal of Prohibition in 1933 with the 21st Amendment could have meant disaster for organized crime. The cash cow of bootlegging was about to become legal business. But the smart operators, including the Chicago outfit, had already started adding variety. Gambling, both legal and illegal, became a major focus. Prostitution, labor racketeering, loan sharking, and various threat schemes all provided money streams. The setup and relationships built during Prohibition could be used again for other criminal businesses. By the late 1930s, Joseph Aiuppa was an established figure in the Chicago outfit, trusted by the leadership, proven in his skills, and putting himself in place for the next phase of his criminal career. The wild days of Prohibition were over, but new chances were appearing. And Joey Aiuppa, now in his early 30s, was perfectly placed to use them. If you wanted to understand the Chicago outfit's power in the mid-20th century, you had to understand Cicero. This simple suburb just west of Chicago itself had been changed in the 1920s into basically a company town. And the company was organized crime. Al Capone had made Cicero his personal area starting in 1924. After finding Chicago itself too hot due to reform-minded mayors and police crackdowns, in Cicero, Capone basically owned the government. The town president, the police chief, the city council, all were either on the outfit's payroll or completely scared. It was a place where gambling dens, bars, and nightclubs worked openly, where outfit business was done in broad daylight, where anyone who caused problems quickly learned the error of their ways. Even after Capone's imprisonment and the end of Prohibition, Cicero stayed an outfit stronghold. And from the late 1940s through the 1960s, the man running Cicero for the outfit was Joseph Aiuppa. This was not a small achievement. Cicero was always the highest earning neighborhood for the Chicago outfit, making millions of dollars each year. The person who controlled Cicero controlled a big part of the outfit's income and therefore had huge power within the organization. Aiuppa's Cicero operation had many parts and was smart. At its heart were many gambling places, each serving different markets and customers. The Frolics was one of his main operations, a casino and nightclub that attracted rich gamblers from Chicago and beyond. The Town Hotel worked as both a legal business and a base for gambling operations. The 411 Club was another key place known to law enforcement, but mostly untouchable due to the corrupted local government. But the real money came from handbooks, gambling operations that took bets on horse racing, sports, and other events. Aiuppa ran many handbooks at specific spots along Cermak Road, the main business street through Cicero. These operations took in huge sums daily, all in cash, all untaxed, flowing straight into outfit money boxes. The size of these operations is hard to understand from our modern view. We are talking about millions of dollars in 1950s and 1960s money, the equal of tens of millions today, being bet and won and lost in small storefronts and backrooms throughout Cicero. Bookies wrote down bets in coded ledgers, runners collected money and gave out payouts, and it all flowed upward to Aiuppa, and from him to the outfit's leadership. But gambling was not Aiuppa's only business. In the early 1930s, he had been involved with Taylor and Company. Seeming to be a furniture maker, in reality, Taylor and Company worked as a cover for the making of illegal slot machines. Slot machines were very profitable. They needed little watching once put in. They worked 24 hours a day, and they made steady income. The outfit placed slots in bars, restaurants, shops, and anywhere else they could force their way into. The Taylor and Company cover allowed them to make these machines without drawing unwanted attention. Aiuppa also built a legal real estate empire working under the business name Rosemar Realty. A touching tribute to his mother Rosalia. This mix of the first parts of Rosalia and Maria, possibly a middle name or another family name, showed that even as Joey built a criminal empire, family stayed central to who he was. Rosemar Realty served many purposes on one level. It was a legal business that made legal income and provided a cover for Aiuppa's lifestyle. How could authorities question his expensive cars and homes when he was a successful real estate developer? On another level, it allowed the outfit to clean money from illegal operations through property buys and sales. And on yet another level, it gave Aiuppa and the outfit control over physical places that could be used for criminal businesses. The real estate holdings were wide. Aiuppa owned apartment buildings, business properties, empty land, a collection worth millions. Some properties made rental income, others were kept for development. Still others worked as covers for illegal operations or as rewards for loyal helpers who were given good deals on properties in exchange for their service. Another key part of Aiuppa's Cicero empire was labor union control, specifically. Local 450 of the hotel and restaurant employees union fell under his influence. Control of unions gave the outfit many advantages. First, it allowed them to put helpers in legal jobs, providing cover for their criminal activities and income. Second, it gave them the ability to threaten businesses, cooperate with the outfit, or face labor troubles. Third, union pension funds could be loaned out to mob-connected businesses, often without expectation of being paid back. And fourth, unions gave political power as they could deliver votes and campaign money to friendly politicians. The smartness of Aiuppa's Cicero operation cannot be overstated. This was not a simple protection racket or a few gambling joints. This was a complex criminal business with legal business covers, political protection, law enforcement corruption, union control, and varied income streams. It needed management skills, strategic thinking, and the ability to handle many operations at the same time while avoiding serious law enforcement attention. And Aiuppa managed it brilliantly. For over 20 years, he ran Cicero as his personal area, making huge wealth for himself and the outfit while keeping a fairly low profile. Unlike showy gangsters who appeared in gossip pages and drew FBI attention, Aiuppa worked in the shadows. Law enforcement knew who he was, knew what he did. But building a case that could be prosecuted was another matter entirely. Part of Aiuppa's success was his management style. He was firm but fair with his workers. He rewarded loyalty and skill. He punished betrayal and failure with extreme prejudice. People who worked for Joey knew exactly where they stood and what was expected of them. This clearness, mixed with his reputation for following through on both promises and threats, made him an effective leader. But perhaps most importantly, Aiuppa understood the importance of political protection. He made sure that key politicians, judges, and law enforcement officials in Cicero and Cook County were either on the outfit's payroll or completely compromised. Election campaigns were funded, judges got envelopes of cash. Police officers looked the other way when problems did come up. They were handled at the political level before they could grow into serious legal threats. This system of corruption was so set that it took decades of federal investigation to even start to break into it. Local authorities were basically useless. They were either part of the system or powerless to act against it. Only federal agencies like the FBI had the resources and independence to seriously investigate the outfit. And even they struggled for years to build cases that would stand up in court. The 1950s and early 1960s were the golden age of Aiuppa's Cicero empire. Money flowed in huge amounts, the operations ran smoothly. Aiuppa's status within the outfit rose steadily. He was no longer just a soldier or even a capo. He was becoming a major power within the organization, a man whose opinion mattered when important decisions were made. But as the 1960s went on, the scene began to change. Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy started an aggressive campaign against organized crime. The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover's direction, began intense investigations of the outfit. New laws and legal tactics were used against mob figures. The comfortable arrangement that had allowed the outfit to work with little punishment was starting to fall apart. And in September 1962, Joseph Aiuppa would make a mistake that, while seeming small, would follow him for the rest of his life and provide one of the most memorable mob nicknames in history. September 1962, the early autumn air carried the first hints of the coming winter as FBI agents, acting on a tip, pulled over a car driven by Joseph Aiuppa. This traffic stop was not random. It was part of Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy's stronger campaign against organized crime, specifically targeting known members of the Chicago outfit. What the agents found in Aiuppa's vehicle was unexpected. 563 frozen mourning doves. Over 500 birds, all carefully frozen, being moved for reasons that were immediately suspicious. To understand why this was important, we need to understand the Migratory Bird Treaty Act of 1918. The Migratory Bird Treaty Act was and still is one of the most important pieces of wildlife protection law in American history. Passed in 1918 to put into effect a treaty between the United States and Canada. It protected migratory bird species from hunting pressures that had driven several species to extinction. The passenger pigeon, once numbering in the billions, had been hunted to extinction by 1914. Other species were following similar paths. Under the act, mourning doves were protected. Hunting them was legal but heavily controlled. Seasons were set, bag limits were enforced, and crucially, no person could have more than 24 mourning doves at any given time, even if those doves had been legally hunted during the right season with proper licenses. Joseph Aiuppa was in possession of 563 doves, more than 23 times the legal limit. The violation was clear and could not be defended. There was no way to explain away 1,000 frozen birds as a simple misunderstanding or an honest mistake. This was clear, large-scale illegal hunting, likely connected to illegal game sales to restaurants and private buyers. The arrest made headlines. Here was a known mob figure caught red-handed breaking federal wildlife law. It was almost funny. The mighty Chicago outfit brought down not by racketeering charges or murder charges, but by too much dove hunting. FBI agents joked about it. Newspapers ran cartoons. The public found it amusing in a way that traditional mob charges were not. But for Aiuppa, this was no laughing matter. Federal charges meant federal court, federal prosecutors, and federal judges, none of whom were on the outfit's payroll. The corrupted local system that had protected him for decades was useless here. He would actually have to face justice. The case moved through the legal system over the next several years. Aiuppa's lawyers, the best that mob money could buy, tried various defenses and delaying tactics, but the evidence was solid. The agents had found the birds. They had counted them. They had written down everything properly. There was no procedural error to use, no technicality to hide behind in 1966. 4 years after the first arrest, Joseph Aiuppa was finally convicted of breaking the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. The sentence was fairly light, 3 months in jail and a $1,000 fine. For a man who had planned operations making millions of dollars, who had ordered murders and attacks, who had corrupted entire town governments, 3 months in jail for having too many dead birds seemed almost tiny. But the real result of the doves incident was not the jail time or the fine. It was the nickname from that moment forward. Joseph Aiuppa would be known as Joey Doves, Joey the Doves, or Mourning Doves. The nickname stuck with a tenacity that must have annoyed him. He had spent decades building a reputation as a serious, dangerous crime boss. He controlled one of the outfit's most profitable areas. He had the respect of his peers and the fear of his enemies. And now he was Joey Doves. Newspapers used the nickname. FBI reports called him Joey Doves. Other mobsters started using it. First behind his back, then finally to his face. It became his identifier, his brand, the thing people remembered about him when he died decades later. Obituaries led with Joey Doves. There's a certain irony here that should not be missed. The nickname, while memorable, actually helped hide the seriousness of Aiuppa's criminal activities. Joey Doves sounds almost funny, like a character from a cartoon rather than a real threat. It made him seem human in a way that the enforcer or the executioner or other grim mob nicknames did not. Perhaps looking back, the nickname served him better than a more frightening name would have. The incident also showed something important about law enforcement's approach to organized crime. In the 1960s, federal authorities were starting to understand that they did not need to prove murder or racketeering to bother and jail mob figures. Any federal violation could work. Tax evasion had brought down Al Capone. The Migratory Bird Treaty Act brought down Joey Aiuppa, at least for a while. This strategy of using whatever legal tool was available rather than focusing only on proving organized crime activity would become more common in the decades ahead. As Aiuppa served his 3 months in 1966, he had time to think about his career path. He was 59 years old, entering what for most people would be retirement years. He had been in the life for nearly 4 decades. He had survived the violent Prohibition era. He had built an empire in Cicero. He had become wealthy and powerful. But he had also been caught, convicted, and jailed for something as ordinary as having too many frozen birds in his car. Perhaps he thought about stepping back, enjoying his wealth, letting younger men take the risks. Perhaps he thought about his parents, long since passed, and wondered what they would think of what their son had become. Perhaps he thought about nothing more than counting the days until his release. What he could not have known as he sat in that cell in 1966 was that his greatest power was still ahead of him. The late 1960s would see huge changes in the Chicago outfit's leadership setup. And when the dust settled, Joey Doves Joseph John Aiuppa, the Sicilian immigrant son from Melrose Park, would be sitting at the very top of one of America's most powerful criminal organizations. The late 1960s and early 1970s were a time of change for the Chicago outfit. The old guard, the men who had come up during Prohibition, who had worked directly with Capone and Torrio, were dying off or retiring. A new generation needed to take the reins. But succession in organized crime is never simple or clean. Too much money and power are at stake. Felix Anthony Milwaukee Phil Alderisio had been one of the outfit's most feared enforcers and high-ranking members. By the late 1960s, he had risen to a position of top leadership, overseeing outfit operations alongside Tony Accardo, who had changed into more of an advisor role. Alderisio was ruthless, efficient, and extremely violent. Exactly what the outfit needed during the wild 1960s when federal pressure was growing. But in 1971, Milwaukee Phil's run came to an end. He was convicted on federal charges and sent to prison where he would die in 1971 from natural causes. His imprisonment created a power vacuum at the top of the outfit. And power vacuums in organized crime tend to be filled quickly. Often violently, Joseph Aiuppa, by this point in his mid-60s, was the logical choice. He had decades of experience. He had proven himself capable of managing complex operations. He controlled the profitable Cicero area. He had working relationships with all the major figures in the outfit, and perhaps most importantly, he had the backing of Tony Accardo, known as Joe Batters for his skill with a baseball bat as a young enforcer, had become the wise elder of the Chicago outfit. Although he had officially stepped back from day-to-day leadership, his opinion still carried huge weight when Accardo supported someone. That person had legitimacy when Accardo opposed someone. That person was in trouble. The arrangement that came out in 1971 was simple in its smartness. Aiuppa would serve as boss, the public face of the outfit's leadership. Making day-to-day decisions and managing operations, Accardo would serve as consigliere, an advisor whose advice would be sought on major decisions. This power-sharing arrangement allowed Aiuppa to use real authority while making sure that Accardo's experience and judgment stayed available. Becoming boss of the Chicago outfit was the high point of a career that had begun more than 4 decades earlier as a driver for Accardo. He had risen from the bottom to the very top through a mix of skill, loyalty, and strategic thinking. He had outlasted rivals, avoided conviction on serious charges, the Doves incident aside, and put himself perfectly for this moment. But being boss of the Chicago outfit in 1971 was very different from what it had been in Capone's day. The easy money of prohibition was long gone. Federal law enforcement had become smart and relentless. RICO statutes, the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, passed in 1970, gave prosecutors powerful new tools to attack organized crime. Electronic watching was becoming more common and more effective. The old system of political protection and police corruption, while still valuable, was more and more not enough against federal investigations. Aiuppa's leadership style showed these new realities. He was cautious, careful, and intensely private. He avoided public appearances. He held sensitive meetings in places that were hard to watch. Outdoor locations, moving cars, crowded restaurants, where conversations would be drowned out by background noise. He trusted very few people completely and kept information separate so that no single person, except his closest advisors, knew the full scope of outfit operations. But being cautious did not mean being weak. Aiuppa understood that the outfit's power finally rested on its willingness to use violence against anyone who threatened its interests. And in the 1970s, there would be several times where Aiuppa would allow extreme violence to protect the outfit and strengthen his own power. One of the most important of these happened in 1975, involving a man who had once been boss himself, Sam Giancana. Salvatore Momo Giancana had been a big figure in the outfit since the 1940s. Finally becoming boss in the late 1950s, his rule had been marked by flashy excess. Affairs with celebrities like Phyllis McGuire of the McGuire sisters. Connections to Hollywood and Las Vegas, and incredibly, involvement in CIA plans to kill Fidel Castro. Giancana had lived large and drawn huge attention. Exactly the opposite of what the outfit needed in a time of growing federal watching. By the mid-1960s, Giancana had been forced out of the boss position and had gone into hiding in Mexico to avoid testifying before grand juries. In 1974, he returned to the United States, and in 1975, he was under pressure to testify before the Church Committee, a Senate committee investigating CIA activities, including the Castro killing plans. But there was another problem with Giancana: his involvement in Mexican casino operations from which he was not sharing profits with the outfit. This was unacceptable. The outfit worked on a system where all important criminal operations had to give a percentage to the organization. Giancana, likely believing his past status gave him independence, had broken this basic rule. In 1975, the decision was made. Sam Giancana had to go on June 19, 1975. Shortly before he was scheduled to testify, Giancana was shot 7 times in his Oak Park home, murdered while cooking sausages in his basement kitchen. The killer was never officially named, but the message was clear: no one, no matter their past position or connections, was above the outfit's justice. The decision to kill Giancana needed approval from the very top of the outfit. As boss, Aiuppa would have been centrally involved in this decision. If not the final authority on it, it was a bold, risky move. Killing a former boss was new in Chicago outfit history, but it showed that Aiuppa was willing to make hard decisions to protect the organization. Another murder that would later be linked to Aiuppa's leadership was that of John Rosselli. Rosselli, like Giancana, had been involved in the CIA's Castro killing plans in 1976. He too was called to testify before the church committee. Rosselli had been talking too freely, saying too much to investigators. He was becoming a problem. In August 1976, Rosselli disappeared. His decomposed body was found 10 days later, stuffed in a 55-gallon oil drum floating in Dumbfoundling Bay near Miami. He had been strangled and shot like the Giancana hit. The Rosselli murder was never officially solved, but informed observers understood it was an outfit operation. These murders sent a message throughout the underworld. The Chicago outfit under Joey Aiuppa was not to be played with. Taught to authorities, take profits, break the rules, and you would pay the final price no matter who you were or what you had done in the past. But Aiuppa's vision for the outfit was not limited to removing problems. He was also looking for chances for new sources of money, for ways to expand the organization's reach and power. And in the 1970s, the biggest chance in organized crime was in Nevada. In the neon-lit desert city of Las Vegas in the 1970s was a city unlike any other in America. What had been a dusty railroad town in the middle of the Mojave Desert had been changed by gambling legalization, organized crime investment, and a steady stream of tourists looking for fun, escape, and easy fortunes. The Strip glittered with huge casino hotels. The Stardust, the Fremont, the Hacienda, the Marina, Caesar's Palace, the Flamingo. Billions of dollars flowed through these places every year. The Chicago outfit had been involved in Las Vegas since the city's early days as a gambling heaven. Bugsy Siegel, although mainly linked with the New York mob, had outfit connections when he opened the Flamingo in 1946. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, various Chicago figures had interests in Vegas casinos, either through direct ownership shares or through more subtle forms of control. But by the 1970s, under Aiuppa's leadership, the outfit was ready to deepen and expand its Vegas operations. The chance was huge, but so were the risks. Nevada gaming regulators were supposed to keep organized crime out of the casino industry. The FBI was watching. Other crime families from Kansas City, Milwaukee, and Cleveland also had interests in Vegas. Moving through this complex scene needed skill, care, and the right people on the ground. For his Vegas representative, Aiuppa chose Anthony "Tony the Ant" Spilatro. This choice would prove to be both brilliant and disastrous, making huge profits while finally contributing to the outfit's downfall. Spilatro was a Chicago native born in 1938 who had grown up in the same Italian neighborhoods that had shaped Aiuppa. He was short, only 5'2", but fiercely violent with a hair-trigger temper and a willingness to use extreme cruelty against anyone who crossed him. He was also smart, charming when he wanted to be, and completely loyal to the outfit. Aiuppa had known Spilatro for years, had watched him work his way up through the ranks, and trusted him to represent Chicago's interests in Nevada. Spilatro arrived in Las Vegas in 1971, seeming to be a legal businessman, but actually as the outfit's enforcer and overseer. His job had many parts: protect outfit interests in the casinos, watch the all-important skimming operations, manage the street-level criminal businesses, drugs, prostitution, loan sharking, and remove anyone who threatened Chicago's position in Vegas. The skimming operation was the crown jewel of the outfit's Vegas activities. The idea was simply smart. Before gambling revenues were counted and reported to Nevada gaming authorities, and before taxes were figured, outfit-connected casino workers would skim off a part of the cash. This untaxed, unreported money would then be moved to Chicago and divided among the various crime families who had interests in the operation. The size of the skimming was amazing. At the Stardust Casino alone, Estimates suggested that millions of dollars per year were being skimmed. The Fremont, the Hacienda, and the Marina casinos were also involved. The operation needed the cooperation of many casino workers. Slot machine supervisors, count room workers, pit bosses, all of whom had to be bribed, scared, or otherwise convinced to take part. The complexity of the operation was matched by its boldness. Nevada's gaming control authorities were supposed to be watchful against exactly this kind of fraud. Casinos were required to have strict accounting procedures. Regular audits were done, yet for years the skimming continued, making a river of money that flowed back to the Midwest. The profits were divided among multiple crime families through a complex arrangement that showed both the outfit's power and its need for cooperation with other organizations. Chicago, as the main organizer and protector of the operation, took the largest share. The Kansas City crime family, which had some historical interests in Vegas, got a big part. Cleveland and Milwaukee also got pieces of the action. This arrangement helped prevent fights between the families and made sure that everyone had a reason to protect the operation. But keeping this arrangement needed constant effort. Alan Glick, who in name owned several of the casinos involved through his Argent Corporation, had to be managed. Glick was a legal businessman who had gotten in over his head, borrowing from Teamster pension funds, which were controlled by the mob. To buy the casinos, he was basically a front man. But he had to be kept in line and stopped from cooperating with authorities. Joseph "Joe" Agosto, a Kansas City mobster who worked in the Tropicana, served as a key link for information and money. Roy Williams, president of the Teamsters Union, was another key figure, making sure that the loan arrangements that made Glick's casino buys possible stayed favorable to the mob. Throughout the 1970s, this complex operation ran smoothly, making tens of millions of dollars for the outfit and its partners. Aiuppa, back in Chicago, got regular reports from Spilatro about the Vegas operations. Money was counted, divided, and given out. New chances were found and used. The system worked. But there were problems developing, many of them connected to Tony Spilatro himself. While Spilatro was effective at his job, he was also more and more reckless. He formed a burglary crew called the Hole in the Wall Gang that targeted jewelry stores, homes, and businesses across Las Vegas. He got involved in drug dealing despite the outfit's traditional ban against narcotics. His violent reputation made him a target of intense law enforcement watching. Even more problematically, Spilatro's personal behavior was becoming a problem. He was having an affair with Jerry McGee, the wife of Frank "Lefty" Rosenthal, a key figure in the Stardust casino operation. This kind of personal drama drew attention and created conflicts that threatened the careful arrangements the outfit had set up. Nevada gaming authorities were also focusing on the outfit's Vegas operations. Frank Rosenthal, who had been effectively running the Stardust and other casinos for the mob, was put in the Black Book, Nevada's list of people banned from casinos, in 1979. This forced him out of his management job and complicated the outfit's ability to control casino operations. The FBI, meanwhile, had begun intense investigations of organized crime's involvement in Las Vegas casinos. They were using smart watching techniques, developing informants, and building cases that would take years to fully develop, but would finally prove devastating. Aiuppa, from his position in Chicago, tried to manage these various problems. He sent messages to Spilatro to calm down his activities, to be less visible, to focus on the skimming operation rather than his various side businesses. But Spilatro, perhaps believing that his distance from Chicago gave him independence, or perhaps simply unable to control his own impulses, continued his reckless behavior. By the early 1980s, it was becoming clear that the Vegas situation could not last. Federal investigations were growing. The skimming operation, while still profitable, was under more watching. Spilatro's activities were drawing too much attention. Something was going to break. It was just a question of when and how bad it would be. In September 1983, that breaking point arrived. A federal grand jury in Kansas City returned a sweeping indictment against 15 defendants, including Joseph Aiuppa, saying there was a plan to hide ownership of Las Vegas casinos and to skim millions in profits. The carefully built empire that had made so much wealth was about to face its final test in federal court. Before we get to the trial and what happened after, it is worth pausing to think about what Joseph Aiuppa had built during his time as boss of the Chicago outfit from 1971 to 1986. This was not simply a continuation of the organization he had inherited. It was a criminal empire that showed his particular skills, priorities, and vision at its peak. The Chicago outfit under Aiuppa's leadership was a multi-state operation with varied money streams and smart management structures. The core of the operation stayed in Chicago and its suburbs, particularly Cicero, where Aiuppa had built his reputation. But branches reached into Las Vegas, into Los Angeles, into various other cities where the outfit had interests. The money sources were varied. Gambling stayed the biggest moneymaker. Both illegal bookmaking operations in Chicago and the Vegas casino interests. Loan sharking provided steady income, preying on gamblers, business owners, and others who could not get legal credit. Labor racketeering continued to be profitable, with the outfit controlling or influencing various unions and using that power to threaten businesses and skim from pension funds. Threats to businesses, particularly in industries like vending machines, video gaming, and waste hauling, made millions. The organizational structure was layered but somewhat flexible. Aiuppa sat at the top as boss, with Tony Accardo as consigliere. Below them were the capos, captains who watched specific areas or operations. Each capo had crews of soldiers who carried out the day-to-day criminal activities. This structure allowed for both central coordination and local action. Communication within this organization had to be extremely careful. The FBI's use of electronic watching meant that phones were dangerous. Offices could be bugged and cars might be wired. Important conversations happened face-to-face, often while walking outdoors where watching was difficult. A coded language developed where nothing clear was ever said. That thing meant murder. The G meant the federal government, and so on. The violence under the outfit's power was strategic and purposeful under Aiuppa's leadership. Unlike some crime bosses who killed impulsively or too much, Aiuppa allowed violence only when it served organizational purposes. Informants were killed to prevent testimony. Rivals were removed to protect areas. Those who stole from the outfit or broke its rules were made examples of, but the violence was real and brutal. Prosecutors would later say that Aiuppa personally approved 13 murders in Chicago and Las Vegas. These were not distant, impersonal decisions. Each represented a human life ended, often in a horrible way, to keep the outfit's power and discipline. One of the most important of these was the murder of Alan Dorfman in January 1983. Dorfman was a powerful figure in the Teamsters Union, managing its Central States pension fund. This pension fund had been used as a virtual bank for organized crime, loaning hundreds of millions to mob-connected businesses and casinos. Dorfman had been convicted alongside Teamsters President Roy Williams of trying to bribe a senator, and there were fears he might cooperate with authorities to reduce his sentence. On January 20th, 1983, Dorfman was shot 7 times in a Lincolnwood hotel parking lot. The hit was carried out in broad daylight, showing both the outfit's boldness and its desperation to silence a possible witness. Aiuppa's role in allowing this murder would later become part of the federal case against him. Managing this empire needed Aiuppa to balance many competing interests and concerns. He had to keep his capos happy by making sure they had profitable areas and the support they needed. He had to keep relationships with other crime families. both to preserve the Vegas arrangements and to prevent conflicts that could turn violent. He had to manage relations with corrupted officials, making sure they stayed bought while not becoming so compromised that they lost their usefulness. And he had to stay ahead of law enforcement, constantly adapting to new investigation techniques and legal strategies. The 1970s and early 1980s were particularly challenging in this way. RICO prosecutions were becoming more common and more effective. The FBI's organized crime investigations were smart and well-funded. Informants were being developed within the outfit. Including some high-ranking members, electronic watching was everywhere. Aiuppa's response was to become more and more cautious and insulated. He communicated less, trusted fewer people, and tried to create layers of deniability between himself and actual criminal acts. The old days of the boss being personally involved in violent operations were over. Now the boss gave vague instructions that were understood by workers and carried out by soldiers, several steps removed from the leadership. But this strategy of insulation had its limits. RICO statutes allowed prosecutors to charge leaders for the actions of their underlings, if they could prove the leaders were directing the criminal business. Electronic watching could capture conversations that, while carefully worded, still showed knowledge of and taking part in criminal activities, and most dangerously, informants could provide direct testimony about what the boss said and did in private meetings. By the early 1980s, despite Aiuppa's best efforts, the walls were closing in. The Vegas skimming operation was under intense investigation. Several key figures had been flipped or were under pressure to cooperate. The federal government was building a case that would prove very hard to defend against. And yet, even as the danger grew, the operation continued. Money was still being skimmed. Loans were still being sharked. Gambling operations still ran. Unions were still being manipulated. The outfit, like a huge ship with huge momentum, continued on its course even as the rocks ahead became more and more visible. Joey Aiuppa, now in his late 70s, had to be feeling the pressure. He had outlasted rivals, built a criminal empire, gathered wealth, and achieved a level of power that his immigrant parents could never have imagined. But he had also made enemies, taken risks, and worked in an increasingly hostile legal environment. The question was not whether the federal government would finally indict him. It was when and whether the case would be strong enough to convict an experienced mob boss who had successfully avoided serious prosecution for more than 5 decades. That answer came in September 1983 when the federal grand jury in Kansas City issued its indictment. The empire that Joey Doves had built was about to face its greatest test. September 1983, the federal courthouse in Kansas City, Missouri became the center of what would be one of the most important organized crime prosecutions in American history. A federal grand jury returned an 8-count indictment against 15 defendants, saying there was a huge plan to hide ownership of Las Vegas casinos and to skim millions of dollars in profits. The defendants read like a who's who of Midwest organized crime. Joseph Aiuppa of Chicago, John Philip Jack Chironi, another high-ranking Chicago outfit member, Carl Angelo De Luna and Carl Thomas Corky Savella from Kansas City, and others representing the various crime families that had taken part in the Vegas operation. The indictment laid out a complex criminal plan spanning years and involving many casinos, many co-plotters, and a fancy system for stealing and giving out casino profits. The government's case was built on many pillars. Electronic watching had captured incriminating conversations. Financial records showed money flows that made no sense if the operation was legal. But most importantly, the government had convinced several key insiders to cooperate and testify. Joseph Aiuppa, a Kansas City mobster who had worked in the Tropicana casino, had been arrested and had agreed to cooperate with authorities. He could provide insider testimony about how the skimming operation worked and who was involved. Alan Glick, the in-name owner of several casinos through his Argent Corporation, had also agreed to cooperate. He could testify about the pressure he had been under, the threats he had gotten, and how he had been forced to allow the skimming to continue. Perhaps most damagingly, Angelo Leonardo, former boss of the Cleveland crime family, had become a government witness. This was extraordinary. A high-ranking mob figure breaking omerta, the code of silence, to testify against other crime families. Leonardo could provide testimony about the arrangement between the various families regarding the Vegas skimming operation, about meetings where the operation was discussed, about how profits were divided. Roy Williams, the Teamsters president who had been convicted in the Dorfman bribery case, was another witness. He could testify about how Teamster pension funds had been used to help mob control of Vegas casinos. Building the defense for this case was a huge challenge. Aiuppa's legal team, like those of the other defendants, was top-notch. Experienced criminal defense lawyers who specialized in organized crime cases. But the evidence was overwhelming. The witnesses were believable. The financial records spoke for themselves. And the prosecutors were highly skilled and completely determined. The trial was scheduled to begin in late 1985. More than 2 years after the indictment, these in-between years were filled with legal moving. Motions to dismiss, motions to suppress evidence, motions to separate defendants, motions for change of location. Each was carefully argued and generally denied. The federal judge watching the case was determined to see it through to trial. For Aiuppa, now 77 years old, these years must have been hugely stressful. He was facing the possibility of dying in prison. The life he had built, the empire he had controlled, the power he had held, all of it was at risk. And there was very little he could do about it. The traditional mob strategies for dealing with legal problems were mostly unavailable. Scaring witnesses would not work. They were under federal protection. Corrupting the jury was too risky with the level of FBI watching. Killing the prosecutors or the judge would bring down heat and would destroy what remained of the organization. The outfit would have to fight this case in court using legal strategies and hope for the best. As the trial date neared, the pressure on all defendants grew. Prosecutors sometimes offered deals to lower-ranking defendants in exchange for their cooperation. Some of these defendants faced the painful choice between loyalty to the organization and possibly spending the rest of their lives in prison. The Code of Omerta was under attack as never before. The trial finally began in October 1985 in federal court in Kansas City. The courtroom was packed with defendants, their lawyers, prosecutors, FBI agents, reporters, and curious onlookers. The jury, regular citizens from the Kansas City area, would be tasked with understanding a complex criminal plan and determining guilt or innocence for each defendant on each count. The prosecution's opening statement laid out their case with clarity and force. They described the decades-long plan to control Las Vegas casinos, the systematic skimming of millions of dollars, the web of corruption that made it possible, and the violent enforcement that kept participants in line. They promised to present documentary evidence, electronic watching, and most importantly, eyewitness testimony from people who had been part of the plan. The defense's opening statements varied by defendant, but generally followed predictable lines. The defendants were legal businessmen. The cooperating witnesses were liars looking to reduce their own sentences. The evidence was circumstantial and open to interpretation. The government was overreaching, trying to criminalize normal business activities. But as the trial went on through late 1985 and into early 1986, the strength of the government's case became more and more clear. Witness after witness took the stand to describe the skimming operation. Alan Glick testified about being forced to front for mob ownership. Joseph Aiuppa described the mechanics of how money was skimmed from the count rooms. Angelo Leonardo provided chilling testimony about mob meetings where the Vegas operation was discussed and violent acts were planned. The electronic watching was played for the jury. Scratchy recordings of conversations where defendants used coded language, but where the meaning was often clear enough. Financial experts walked the jury through the money flows, showing how profits disappeared from casino books and reappeared in the hands of mob figures. The defense lawyers cross-examined aggressively, trying to poke holes in witness believability, suggesting other interpretations of evidence, arguing that the government had not proven its case beyond a reasonable doubt. Some witnesses were indeed challenged on certain details. Some of the evidence was less clear than prosecutors suggested, but the overall story was compelling and consistent. Multiple witnesses who had no reason to coordinate their testimony told basically the same story. Documentary evidence backed up their accounts. The watching recordings, while not clearly incriminating in every case, fit the pattern the witnesses described. Joseph Aiuppa sat through all of this day after day, listening to the destruction of his life's work being described in clinical detail. He was an old man now, his health not what it had been, facing the very real possibility that he would never be free again. Whatever thoughts went through his mind during those long trial days, he kept them to himself, keeping the calm manner that had served him for decades. The trial stretched on for months. Testimony, cross-examination, the introduction of hundreds of exhibits, endless legal arguments outside the jury's presence. The complexity of the case, the number of defendants, and the thoroughness of both sides' presentations all added to making this one of the longest organized crime trials in federal history at that time. Finally, in January 1986, the case went to the jury after months of testimony. The 12 citizens who had been listening to all of this evidence now had to decide, were these defendants guilty of the crimes charged? Or had the government failed to prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt? January 22, 1986, the jury, after days of thinking, returned to the courtroom with their verdict. The tension in the room was thick, defendants and their families on one side, prosecutors, FBI agents on the other, all waiting to hear the result of months of trial and investigation. The verdict was read count by count, defendant by defendant, for Joseph Aiuppa. The news was devastating. Guilty on plan charges, guilty on charges related to hiding casino ownership, guilty on charges related to skimming casino profits. 4 other defendants, including John Chironi, were also convicted on multiple counts. The jury had found the government's case convincing. They had believed the witnesses. They had been convinced by the evidence. The Chicago outfit's Vegas operation had been exposed, and its leadership was going to prison. The courtroom broke out in chaos, shouted conversations, defendants talking with lawyers, family members crying. For the prosecutors and FBI agents, it was a moment of triumph. The high point of years of dangerous, difficult work for the defendants. It was the worst-case scenario realized. But conviction was only half the process. Now came sentencing, where the judge would determine how much time each defendant would serve. Given the scope of the crimes, the amount of money involved, and the defendants' leadership roles in organized crime, harsh sentences were expected. The sentencing hearing was held on March 28, 1986. Joseph Aiuppa, now 79 years old, stood before the federal judge to hear his fate. The prosecutors recommended a severe sentence, arguing that Aiuppa had been a leader of a huge criminal plan, that he had made himself rich through decades of criminal activity, and that deterrence needed a big prison term. Aiuppa's lawyers argued for leniency based on his age and health. They pointed out that he was nearly 80 years old, that he had various medical conditions, that he had already been effectively punished by the conviction itself. They asked the judge to show mercy to an elderly man whose remaining years were few. The judge listened to both sides and then gave the sentence: 28.5 years in federal prison and a fine of $1,143,000. It was an extraordinarily harsh sentence for a man of Aiuppa's age. It was effectively a life sentence at 79 years old. Aiuppa would have to live to be over 107 to complete his sentence. The judge added one particularly cruel condition. Aiuppa would be eligible for parole only if his health got worse to the point of being terminal. In other words, he could get out of prison only when he was literally dying. This sentencing condition showed the federal judge's frustration with organized crime figures who had avoided serious punishment for decades. Aiuppa had been involved in criminal activity since the 1920s. He had built a fortune through illegal means. He had ordered murders, corrupted officials, and run a huge criminal empire. Now finally he was going to pay a price equal to his crimes. The conviction and sentencing were front-page news not just in Chicago and Kansas City, but nationally. Major newspapers like the Chicago Tribune ran wide coverage, noting that this was one of the Justice Department's most important victories against organized crime in 2 decades. The case had successfully prosecuted the leadership of multiple crime families for one of the most profitable criminal schemes in American history. For the Chicago outfit, the results were severe. The boss and several key figures were going to prison for extremely long sentences. The Vegas operation, which had made tens of millions of dollars, was effectively finished. Federal watching of the organization would grow. And there was still the problem of what to do about Tony Spilatro. Spilatro, the Chicago outfit's man in Las Vegas, was widely blamed for bringing the heat that led to the investigation and convictions. His reckless behavior, his violent reputation, his various illegal activities, all of it had drawn federal attention that finally unraveled the skimming operation from the outfit's view. Spilatro had failed in his most basic responsibility to protect Chicago's interests while avoiding attention. The decision about what to do with Spilatro was made in January 1986, shortly after the convictions, but before Aiuppa had been sentenced. Despite his imprisonment, Aiuppa stayed the boss, and his input on major decisions was still sought. Whether he personally ordered Spilatro's murder or merely agreed to it is unclear. But the outfit's leadership decided that Tony the Ant had to go, January 1986, while Joseph Aiuppa and the other convicted defendants waited for sentencing. The Chicago outfit held a meeting at the Como Inn in North Riverside, a suburban Chicago location that the organization sometimes used for important gatherings. The attendees included the outfit's remaining leadership, those who had not been swept up in the Vegas case, and who would need to manage the organization going forward. The topic of discussion, Tony Spilatro. The verdict was unanimous. He had to be removed. His reckless behavior in Las Vegas had destroyed one of the most profitable operations in outfit history. His violence had drawn FBI attention. His affair with Jerry McGee had created personal drama that threatened important relationships. His various criminal businesses from burglary to drug dealing had broken outfit rules and created additional legal exposure. From the outfit's cold, businesslike view, Spilatro had become a problem that outweighed his usefulness. The organization had no room for sentiment, no tolerance for members who threatened its survival. Spilatro had to be killed. And it had to be done in a way that sent a message to anyone else who might think about putting their personal interests ahead of the organization's. But killing Tony Spilatro was not going to be easy. He was paranoid, violent, and always armed. He had survived several attempts on his life in Vegas. He knew he was in trouble with the outfit leadership. Getting close enough to kill him would need trickery. He would have to be lured into a situation where he could not defend himself. The plan that came out was both simple and evil. Spilatro and his younger brother, Michael, who had worked with Tony in Vegas, would be told they were being called back to Chicago for a meeting. Not to be killed, but to be promoted. Tony was supposedly going to be made a made man, formally brought into the outfit with all the honor and status that involved. Michael was being offered a position of responsibility as well. For Tony Spilatro, this must have been both a relief and a validation. Despite his problems, despite the heat he brought down, the organization still valued him enough to give him formal status. Or so he thought. On June 14, 1986, Tony and Michael Spilatro drove to a house in Bensonville, Illinois, a Chicago suburb. They believed they were going to a ceremony, perhaps a celebration. Instead, they were walking into a trap. What happened in that Bensonville basement was brutal, even by mob standards. The Spilatro brothers were attacked by multiple outfit members, beaten with fists and possibly with blunt objects. The violence was savage and long. This was not a quick execution. It was a message killing designed to cause maximum suffering. Tony Spilatro, the feared enforcer who had terrorized Las Vegas for 15 years, who had murdered many people himself, was beaten to death. His brother Michael, guilty mainly of being connected to Tony, suffered the same fate. Their bodies, when later examined, showed signs of wide blunt force trauma after the brothers were dead. Their bodies were moved to a remote location in Enos, Indiana, about 100 miles south of Chicago. The location was important. It was near land that Joseph Aiuppa had used for hunting. Whether this was on purpose, a final insult from Aiuppa to his fallen helper, or merely a coincidence is unknown. The bodies were buried in a shallow grave in a cornfield. The killers believed the bodies would stay hidden, possibly forever, buried in a remote rural area covered by corn growing throughout the summer. The grave might never have been found if the farmer who owned the land had not noticed the disturbed earth. On June 22, 1986, just 8 days after the murders, an Indiana farmer found the bodies while working in his field. The corpses were badly decomposed from their time in the ground during early summer heat. The farmer immediately called police, who began investigating what appeared to be a double murder. Identifying the bodies took time. The decomposition had made visual identification hard. But dental records provided by the victim's brother, Patrick Spilatro, who was a dentist, confirmed what investigators suspected. These were the bodies of Tony and Michael Spilatro. The news of the discovery and identification made international headlines. Tony Spilatro had been a legendary figure in Las Vegas, the real-life inspiration for the character Nicky Santoro in the movie Casino, which would be released in 1995, nearly a decade later. His violent death, along with his brothers, was the kind of sensational mob story that captured public attention. For law enforcement, the murder of the Spilatro brothers was obviously mob-related, but proving who ordered and carried out the killings was another matter. No one was charged with the murders for many years. The code of silence held witnesses, if there were any beyond the actual killers. We're not talking for the Chicago outfit. The Spilatro murders served their purpose. They showed that the organization still had teeth, that it would enforce discipline even against its own members when needed. The message to other outfit members was clear. No one is untouchable. Fail the organization, threaten its existence, and you will pay the final price. But the murders also showed the outfit's weakness. A truly powerful organization would not have needed to kill its own members. It would have kept discipline through respect and loyalty rather than fear and violence. The need to murder Spilatro showed the desperation of an organization that was losing control, that was under attack from law enforcement, that was struggling to keep its operations in the face of prosecutions and informants. For Joseph Aiuppa, sitting in federal prison as news of the Spilatro murders broke, the killings must have represented a complex mix of emotions. On one hand, a problem had been solved. On the other hand, it was another example of how the organization he had led for 15 years was falling apart. The Vegas operation was gone. Many key figures were imprisoned. His helper was dead, murdered by his own colleagues. And Aiuppa himself faced the prospect of dying in prison, locked away from the family, wealth, and power that had defined his life for so many decades. Federal prison is a harsh environment for anyone, but for a 79-year-old man used to power, wealth, and respect, it represented a dramatic fall from grace. Joseph Aiuppa entered the federal prison system in 1986 to begin serving his 28-and-a-half-year sentence. He was first jailed at the United States Penitentiary in Leavenworth, Kansas, one of the oldest and most famous federal prisons in the country. Leavenworth, the very name carried weight in the American criminal mind. Built in 1897, the huge stone fortress had held some of the most dangerous and famous criminals in American history. Machine Gun Kelly had walked these halls. Robert Stroud, the Birdman of Alcatraz, had served time here before his transfer. Bootleggers, bank robbers, spies, and traitors had all passed through Leavenworth's gates, and few came out unchanged. The approach to the prison must have been a sobering experience for Aiuppa. The fortress-like structure rises from the Kansas landscape like something from another time. Huge stone walls, guard towers, the architecture of punishment and control. For a man who had spent decades avoiding exactly this fate, who had seen so many helpers and rivals disappear into the prison system, the reality of finally joining them must have been overwhelming. Processing into federal prison strips away every bit of dignity and status. Aiuppa would have been photographed, fingerprinted, searched invasively, thoroughly, humiliatingly. His expensive clothes, the tailored suits that marked him as a man of means, were replaced with standard prison issue. His personal things, whatever he had been allowed to bring, were listed, stored, or sent away. The change from crime boss to inmate number was complete and could not be reversed. The daily routine of prison life is designed to be monotonous, controlled, and utterly predictable. Wake up at a set time, breakfast in the mess hall, work assignment or recreation yard, lunch, more work or yard time, dinner. Count time when every inmate must be in their cell to be counted. Lights out, day after day, week after week, month after month. Year after year, the same routine. The same faces, the same walls for Joseph Aiuppa, a man who had spent his entire adult life making his own decisions, giving orders, determining his own schedule. This loss of control must have been deeply difficult. He could not decide when to eat, when to sleep, where to go, what to do. Every part of his existence was now controlled by prison guards, who did not care that he had once been one of the most powerful mob bosses in America. The physical environment was equally challenging. Prison cells are small, typically around 6 by 8 feet for a single cell, perhaps slightly larger for cells that house 2 inmates. Aiuppa would have spent most of his non-working hours confined to this tiny space, a metal bed frame with a thin mattress, a small metal desk and stool, a toilet and sink combination, perhaps a small shelf for personal items. This was now his world, replacing the comfortable homes, the nice restaurants, the freedom of movement he had enjoyed for nearly 8 decades. The other inmates presented their own challenges. Federal prisons house a wide variety of criminals. White-collar criminals serving time for fraud or theft, drug traffickers, violent offenders, and other organized crime figures. Some inmates would have known of Aiuppa's reputation and might have shown respect. Others, particularly younger inmates, might have seen an old man who was no longer in a position to help or harm them. Prison culture has its own rules, rankings, and dangers, even in a federal prison, which generally lacks the extreme gang violence of some state facilities. There are threats, disputes over perceived disrespect, conflicts over gambling debts or black market transactions, the constant possibility of violence from inmates with nothing to lose. Aiuppa, despite his age, would have needed to keep his awareness and his willingness to defend himself if necessary. But Aiuppa also had advantages that many inmates lacked. The Chicago outfit still existed outside the prison walls, and they took care of their own particularly high-ranking members. Money could be arranged to be put in his commissary account, allowing him to buy items beyond the basics provided by the prison. Better food from the commissary, personal care items, writing materials. Lawyers could be sent to visit him, providing both legal services and a connection to the outside world. Most importantly, even from prison. Aiuppa stayed the boss of the Chicago outfit, at least in name. Important decisions still needed his input. The organization needed continuity. Needed someone with the authority to make final decisions on major issues until a new boss was formally put in place. That stayed Aiuppa. This created a unique situation. Aiuppa's lawyers would visit regularly, seeming to discuss his case, appeals, and legal matters. But these visits also worked as channels for information flowing in both directions. Messages from the outside could be given to Aiuppa, carefully worded to avoid obvious criminal content, but understood by both parties. Aiuppa's responses, his decisions, his guidance, all could be sent back through these same channels. The FBI was well aware of this dynamic. They watched visits as much as possible. Though lawyer-client privilege created limits on their watching, they intercepted and read mail. They developed informants within the prison who might overhear conversations. But the outfit had decades of experience communicating under watch, and they were skilled at using coded language and indirect references that were hard to prosecute. One of the most important decisions made during this time was the selection of leadership to run the outfit's day-to-day operations. This was not a decision Aiuppa could make alone. It needed agreement among the remaining leadership, but his opinion carried huge weight, and the man chosen would need his blessing. John No Nose DeFranco emerged as the choice. The nickname came from a violent incident years earlier when part of his nose had been bitten off during a fight. But DeFranco was far more than his colorful nickname suggested. Born in 1928, he was in his late 50s during this time. Young enough to have energy and skill, old enough to have wide experience and proven judgment. DeFranco had been with the outfit since the 1950s, working his way up through various roles. He had been a skilled burglar in his youth, part of crews that did smart break-ins. He had been involved in the juice loan business, the outfit's loan sharking operations that made steady income. He had managed gambling operations. Most importantly, he had shown loyalty, care, and the ability to earn money without drawing too much law enforcement attention. From his prison cell, Aiuppa gave his approval for DeFranco's rise. Messages were sent, meetings were held, and the change was made. DeFranco would run the day-to-day operations, making decisions on routine matters, managing the various crews and their operations, but major decisions, questions of war and peace, life and death, those would still be sent to Aiuppa when possible. This arrangement showed both Aiuppa's continuing influence and the reality of his limits. He could no longer manage the details, could not meet with people quickly, could not respond to rapidly developing situations, but his experience, his judgment, his understanding of the organization's history and dynamics, these stayed valuable. DeFranco and the others could run the machine, but they wanted the original architect's input on major changes. The selection of DeFranco also showed a shift in the outfit's approach to leadership. Unlike the more showy bosses of earlier times, DeFranco was deliberately low profile. He avoided media attention, kept a modest lifestyle, and focused on business rather than reputation. This showed the new reality that organized crime worked in. The days when a mob boss could be a public figure were over. Survival needed anonymity as months turned into years. The routine of prison life continued for Aiuppa. He was an elderly man in an environment designed for much younger individuals. The food, while adequate, was institutional and bland. Nothing like the Italian meals he had grown up with, or the fine restaurant dining he had enjoyed during his years of freedom. The medical care, while constitutionally required, was basic and often slow: the constant noise, the lack of privacy, the loss of dignity, all took their toll. Aiuppa's health, never strong in his late 70s, began a steady decline. The stress of imprisonment, the poor diet, the lack of quality medical care, and simply the advance of age all added. He developed various ailments common to elderly inmates: heart problems, difficulties with mobility, chronic pain. Each day was a struggle, and each day he knew he was unlikely to ever walk free again. The other inmates around him changed constantly. Some were released, completing their sentences and returning to the outside world. Others arrived, beginning their own journeys through the federal prison system. But Aiuppa stayed a fixture. An old man serving what everyone understood was a death sentence disguised as a prison term. There were small moments of connection to his former life. Visits from family members, though these became less frequent over time. As travel to Kansas was burdensome and expensive, letters from old helpers, carefully worded to avoid incriminating content, but giving news and keeping relationships. Occasional mentions in news articles about organized crime or the Chicago outfit that would make their way to him through newspapers other inmates might share. He would have heard about the continuing decline of the organization he had led: more indictments, more convictions, more members choosing cooperation over prison. The money streams were drying up. The political protection networks were falling apart. The old certainties of the outfit's power were going away year by year. The Las Vegas connection, which had made so much wealth but finally led to his downfall, was completely cut. The casinos that had been sources of millions in skimmed profits were now under tight corporate control with smart accounting systems and regulatory watching. The days of count room skimming were over. The outfit's presence in Vegas had been reduced to almost nothing. The Cicero operations that had been Aiuppa's personal power base for decades were also reduced. Federal investigations and state prosecution had disrupted the gambling operations. The real estate empire had been partly taken through civil forfeiture. The union control was weakening as federal watching of labor organizations increased. The area that had made Aiuppa's reputation and fortune was no longer the gold mine it had been. Perhaps most painfully, Aiuppa would have learned of the fate of Tony Spilatro. The news of the Spilatro brothers' murders in June 1986, just months after his own conviction, must have reached him in prison. Whether he had been consulted about the decision to kill Spilatro, whether he had approved it, or whether it had been done by the remaining leadership without his input, this stays unclear, but the message was unmistakable. The organization would survive by any means necessary, even if that meant killing its own members. The discovery of the Spilatro bodies near land Aiuppa had used for hunting, whether coincidence or deliberate message, must have struck him as grimly ironic. The cornfield where the bodies were buried was not far from areas where Aiuppa had hunted doves and other game in better times. Now it was a grave for a man who had served him, who had made him millions, but who had finally become a problem. As 1986 turned to 1987, and then into 1988 and beyond, the years began to blur together. The monotony of prison life, the absence of stimulation, the limited social interaction, all added to a kind of time fog where one day was largely no different from the next. For a man who had lived such an eventful, dramatic life, this slow fade into irrelevance must have been its own form of torture. Appeals of his conviction were filed, as they are in almost every serious criminal case. Aiuppa's lawyers argued various points of law, challenged the admissibility of evidence, questioned the jury instructions, but federal convictions, particularly in well-prepared cases like the Vegas skimming prosecution, are rarely overturned on appeal. The evidence had been strong. The trial had been fair, and the conviction stood. There was also the mathematical reality of his sentence. Even with good behavior credit, even with the possibility of parole, Aiuppa would have to serve a big part of his 28-and-a-half-year sentence. And the judge had put on a unique condition. Parole would be available only if his health became terminal. He could not simply serve his time and be released. He had to be literally dying before the system would let him go. This condition showed the judge's frustration with organized crime figures who had avoided serious punishment for decades. Judges knew that mobsters like Aiuppa had committed far more crimes than they were ever charged with, had caused immeasurable harm to society, and had corrupted public institutions. When they finally had such a figure in custody with a solid conviction, they wanted to make sure the punishment was meaningful. But it was also a condition that basically required Aiuppa to be on death's door before he could experience freedom again. For an elderly man in declining health, this meant his prison cell would likely be the last place he would see before a hospital bed and then a coffin. By the early 1990s, Aiuppa's health had gotten much worse. The energy he had kept into his 70s was gone. He was now a frail old man, walking slowly, if at all, suffering from multiple age-related ailments. The prison's medical facilities were adequate for routine care, but not equipped for the complex needs of the seriously ill elderly inmate. As a result, Aiuppa was moved from Leavenworth to the Federal Medical Center in Rochester, Minnesota. This facility, run by the Bureau of Prisons, was specifically designed to provide medical care for inmates with serious health issues. It was still very much a prison, security restrictions, loss of freedom. But with better medical abilities, Rochester represented a slight improvement in Aiuppa's quality of life. The medical care was better, more responsive to his needs. The environment was somewhat less harsh than a regular penitentiary. But he was still jailed, still cut off from the life he had known, still serving a sentence he would never complete. In Rochester, Aiuppa would have been housed in a unit with other elderly or sick inmates, men who, like him, were serving out their final years or months in federal custody. Some were also organized crime figures from various times. Others were corrupt politicians, white-collar criminals, or violent offenders whose health had failed. They shared the common bond of knowing they would likely die in federal custody. The days in Rochester passed much like they had at Leavenworth, just with more medical appointments, more time in medical facilities, more awareness of physical decline. Aiuppa was getting treatment for his various conditions, but treatment for an 85-year-old, then 86-year-old, then 87-year-old man can only do so much. The body wears out. Systems fail. And finally, medicine can only manage symptoms rather than cure conditions. Outside the prison walls, the world continued to change in ways that would have been unimaginable when Aiuppa first entered organized crime in the 1920s. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, ending the Cold War that had defined global politics for decades. The internet was beginning to come out, though it would not become mainstream for a few more years. Cellular phones were becoming common. DNA evidence was changing criminal investigations. The organizational scene of crime was changing as well. Traditional organized crime families were in decline. Hit by RICO prosecutions and informants, new criminal organizations were coming out. Russian organized crime groups, Chinese triads, Mexican drug trafficking organizations. The criminal world Aiuppa had known and mastered was being replaced by something basically different. The Chicago outfit continued to exist, but as a shadow of its former self, John DeFranzo was managing operations. But the chances were limited and the dangers were great. Many traditional rackets were no longer possible. The organization was in survival mode, trying to make enough money to support its members, while avoiding the federal attention that had destroyed so much of its leadership. Leadership had officially changed through several figures during Aiuppa's imprisonment. Joseph "Joe" Ferriola had taken over as boss in the late 1980s, but he died in 1989 of natural causes. Samuel "Black Sam" Carlisi succeeded him, But Carlisi himself was indicted in 1990 and convicted in 1993. The instability at the top showed the broader instability of the organization. Through all of this, Aiuppa stayed in Rochester. His world shrank to the limits of a prison medical facility. His power reduced to occasional talks on major matters. The empire he had built was in ruins. The organization he had led was in disarray. The life he had lived was over in everything but the technical sense. By 1995, Aiuppa was 88 years old and in serious decline. Multiple health issues had built up to the point where his continued survival was uncertain. His lawyers began preparing arguments for compassionate release. The only way he could be freed given the terms of his sentence. They would need to show that his health was terminal, that he was in immediate danger of death. The process of seeking compassionate release is complex and often unsuccessful. The Bureau of Prisons must evaluate the inmate's medical condition. The sentencing judge must approve the release. Prosecutors have a chance to object. And there is always the concern that granting release to a famous crime figure will be seen as being soft on crime. But in Aiuppa's case, the arguments were convincing. He was nearly 90 years old. His health was failing on many fronts. He posed no threat to society. He was too frail to pose a physical threat to anyone. And his organization was so reduced that any theoretical threat from his release was minimal. And most importantly, he met the technical requirement. His health had gotten worse to a terminal state. In January 1996, after months of legal process, Joseph John Aiuppa was granted compassionate release. On January 19, 1996, he walked out of federal custody for the last time. He had served nearly 10 years of his sentence. He was 89 years old, and he had less than 14 months to live. The Joseph Aiuppa, who returned to Illinois in January 1996, looked little like the powerful crime boss who had ruled the Chicago outfit just a decade earlier. Nearly 90 years old, his body damaged by age and illness. He moved slowly and with difficulty. The sharp mind that had moved through the treacherous waters of organized crime for 7 decades was still present, but housed in a failing physical vessel. The practical arrangements for his release had been made by family members and perhaps by loyal helpers from the outfit. He would need a place to live, medical care, help with daily activities at 89. With serious health issues, he could no longer live on his own. The man who had once commanded hundreds and controlled millions now needed help with the basic activities of daily living. The location where Aiuppa spent his final months has been kept deliberately private, but it was somewhere in the Chicago area, likely in one of the western suburbs he had known his entire life. Perhaps it was with family, perhaps it was in a medical facility, perhaps it was a combination, home care added to by frequent hospitalizations as his condition worsened. The world that greeted Aiuppa upon his release was vastly different from the one he had left a decade earlier. Technologically, the changes were deep. The internet, which barely existed when he entered prison, was now becoming mainstream. Email was replacing letters. Cellular phones were common. The digital revolution was changing how people communicated, how business was done, how society worked. Chicago itself had changed. The city had continued its post-industrial change. Old manufacturing districts were being redeveloped. The demographic makeup of neighborhoods had shifted. The political scene had evolved. The city that had been Aiuppa's base of operations for most of the 20th century was entering a new time. But perhaps most striking to Aiuppa, had he been well enough to notice, was the state of organized crime. The Chicago outfit existed, but barely. The Vegas money was long gone. The Sisho gambling empire had been taken apart. Traditional rackets were no longer possible. Most devastating of all, the code of omerta had been broken by a wave of cooperating witnesses. The family secrets investigation was already underway, though it would not end in indictments until years after Aiuppa's death. Federal agents and prosecutors were building a huge case against the outfit. And they were doing it with the cooperation of made members, who had decided that survival and freedom were more important than loyalty to an organization that would kill them without hesitation if it served organizational purposes. This breaking of the code showed a basic shift in organized crime. For generations, the threat of death had been enough to make sure of silence. Members understood that cooperation with authorities meant execution, not might mean, but definitely meant. The certainty of this consequence had been enough to keep most members silent, even when facing decades in prison. But RICO prosecutions had changed the calculation. Sentences of 20, 30, 40 years or even life had become common for high-ranking mob figures. Faced with dying in prison versus cooperating and entering witness protection, more and more members chose cooperation, and once a few broke the code, it became easier for others to rationalize doing the same. For someone like Aiuppa, who had lived his entire criminal career under the old code, this change must have been hard to understand. The code was not just a practical matter, it was a point of honor, a defining characteristic of what it meant to be a member of La Cosa Nostra. Breaking it was not just betrayal, but a basic violation of one's identity as a man of honor. Yet the code had been broken repeatedly, and the organization had been unable to stop it. The old penalties, death for informants and their families, were still enforced when possible, but federal witness protection made enforcement difficult. Cooperating witnesses were taken away, given new identities, protected by the full power of the federal government. The outfit could still kill those who stayed within reach, but they could not reach everyone anymore. If Aiuppa was aware of these developments, they must have seemed like the final confirmation that the world he had known was truly gone. The organization he had given his life to, the principles he had lived by, the code he had honored, all of it was falling apart. The outfit would continue to exist in some form, but it would never again be what it had been during his years of leadership. Aiuppa's final months were likely spent in a haze of pain management, medical treatments, and the simple struggle to continue existing. At 89, with terminal health conditions, each day was a challenge: breathing, eating, moving. Activities that younger people take for granted become difficult for the very elderly. And for someone who had lived as intensely as Aiuppa, who had held such power and experienced such dramatic events, this slow fade must have been particularly difficult. Did he think about his life during those final months? Did he think about the choices he had made, the people he had hurt, the crimes he had committed? Did he feel sorry for the murders he had ordered, the corruption he had spread, the harm he had caused? Or did he keep until the end that he had simply played the game according to its rules, that he had done what was necessary to succeed in the world he had been born into? These questions can never be answered definitely. Aiuppa left no memoir, gave no deathbed confession, offered no final accounting of his life. He kept the silence that had marked his criminal career, even as that career came to its inevitable end. Whatever thoughts occupied his mind in those final months, whatever emotions he felt, whatever regrets or satisfactions he experienced, all of it died with him. Family members likely visited during this time, though which family members and how often stays private. Aiuppa had been married, had family connections, but the details of his personal life had always been kept separate from his criminal activities. This separation, this ability to keep apart family life and criminal life, was common among organized crime figures of his generation. Perhaps old helpers from the outfit came to pay their respects. Though they would have been cautious, visiting a dying mob boss could draw FBI attention. Watching might be in place to identify and photograph visitors. A prudent move would be to stay away, to remember him privately rather than risk exposure by visiting publicly. But then again, for some of the old-timers who had known Aiuppa for decades, who had worked with him during the glory years of the outfit, the risk might have been worth it. There is a human element even in organized crime, friendships, genuine respect. The desire to pay final respects to someone who had been important in one's life. Some visitors likely came carefully, briefly, to say goodbye to a man who had been a giant in their world. The medical actions during this time would have been for comfort rather than cure. At 89, with multiple failing organ systems, the goal was comfort rather than recovery. Pain management, treatment of symptoms, keeping dignity as much as possible. These were the focuses of his medical care. Aggressive treatments that might be used for younger patients would have been inappropriate and potentially cruel for someone in Aiuppa's condition. Hospitalizations likely became more frequent as his condition worsened. Each health crisis would trigger a trip to the emergency room, admission to the hospital, stabilization, and then return to wherever he was living. This cycle is common for terminally ill elderly patients. The body fails in one system, is temporarily stabilized, then fails in another system, needing another action. The details of Aiuppa's final weeks are not public record, but the path is predictable for someone in his condition. Increasing weakness, difficulty eating and drinking. Decreased consciousness, organ systems beginning to fail one by one. The body having lasted nearly 9 decades, simply wearing out. On February 22, 1997, Joseph John Aiuppa died at Elmhurst Memorial Hospital in Elmhurst, Illinois. Elmhurst is a suburb directly west of Chicago, not far from Melrose Park. Where he had been born nearly 90 years earlier, he had come full circle, returning to the area where his life had begun to draw his final breath. The official cause of death was not publicly told, which is typical for private citizens and their families, given his age and known health issues. It was presumably related to heart disease, organ failure, or some combination of age-related conditions. The specific medical details were unimportant. Joseph Aiuppa died because he was 89 years old and his body had reached the end of its natural lifespan. The news of his death was carried in newspapers across the country. The Chicago Tribune, which had covered his trial and conviction widely, published an obituary that summed up his life and criminal career. The headline identified him as a reputed Chicago mob boss, using the term reputed as newspapers typically did, even for convicted criminals when discussing their mob connections. The obituary recounted his rise from modest beginnings to the leadership of the Chicago outfit. It mentioned his nickname, Joey Doves, and the incident that had inspired it. It discussed the Vegas skimming operation and his conviction. It noted that he was considered the last Chicago mob figure with direct connections to the Al Capone era. It was a factual summary of a criminal life, neither glorifying nor completely condemning. Other newspapers around the country picked up the story. The New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the Las Vegas Review-Journal, all mentioned his passing for these publications. Aiuppa's death showed the end of an era, the passing of one of the last links to the golden age of American organized crime. In Las Vegas, where Aiuppa's organization had once held huge power, his death was noted with particular interest, the city he had helped corrupt, the casinos his organization had skimmed for millions, the operation that had finally led to his downfall. All of it was part of Vegas history, and his death closed a chapter of that history. The funeral arrangements were handled privately by his family, unlike the fancy mob funerals of earlier times, which had been public shows with hundreds of mourners and wide media coverage. Aiuppa's funeral was deliberately low-key. The family had no desire to create a media circus, and any surviving outfit members who might have wanted to attend would have been cautious about being publicly identified. Joseph Aiuppa was buried at Queen of Heaven Cemetery in Hillside, Illinois. Queen of Heaven is a Catholic cemetery that has been the final resting place for many Chicago area residents, including other figures connected to organized crime over the years. The cemetery is well kept with gently rolling hills, mature trees, and a quiet dignity fitting for a place of eternal rest. Aiuppa's grave is marked by a modest headstone bearing his name and his dates of birth and death: December 1st, 1907, February 22nd, 1997. There are no fancy inscriptions, no mention of his role in organized crime, no sign of the life he lived, just a name and dates. Like thousands of other graves in the cemetery, this modest memorial is fitting in its way. Aiuppa had spent most of his criminal career trying to avoid attention, to work in the shadows, to be powerful without being famous. Unlike mob bosses who wanted publicity and recognition, he had preferred anonymity. His simple grave marker shows the same philosophy. Present but unremarkable, there if you know to look for it, but not drawing attention to itself. In the days and weeks following his death, there would have been discussions within what remained of the Chicago outfit about what his passing meant. He had been the last direct link to the organization's founding time, the last person alive who could remember working under Capone's shadow. His death symbolized the final cutting of that historical connection. But in practical terms, Aiuppa's death changed little. He had been out of power since his imprisonment in 1986. More than a decade earlier, the organization had continued without him. Adapted to his absence, moved on, his death was more symbolic than operational. The end of an era rather than a disruption of current activities. For law enforcement agencies that had spent decades investigating Aiuppa and the Chicago outfit, his death closed a file, but did not end their work. The organization still existed, still did criminal activities, still needed watching and prosecution, but there was perhaps a sense of satisfaction that Aiuppa had finally been brought to justice, that he had spent his final years either imprisoned or as a frail shadow of his former self. For the families of those killed on Aiuppa's orders, his death brought no real closure. Sam Giancana, John Rosselli, Alan Dorfman, Tony and Michael Spilatro, and the others who had been murdered on his authority. They were still gone, their family still grieved. Aiuppa's death did not undo the harm he caused, or bring back the loved ones who had been taken from them. The story of Joseph Aiuppa does not end with his death in 1997. His impact on organized crime, on Las Vegas, on Chicago, and on American culture continues to be felt more than 2 decades later. To understand his legacy, we must look at many dimensions: what he accomplished, what he destroyed, what he represented, and what his life teaches us about organized crime, justice, and the American experience. From a purely organizational view, Aiuppa was one of the most successful mob bosses in American history. His time as boss of the Chicago outfit from 1971 to 1986 was marked by huge profitability, relative stability, and successful moving through an increasingly hostile legal environment. He managed an organization that made tens of millions of dollars each year through varied criminal businesses, while keeping enough discipline to prevent the kind of internal warfare that had destroyed other crime families. His management of the Cicero area alone would have been a big achievement. For more than 20 years, he ran what was basically a criminal town, a suburb where the mob controlled the government, ran gambling places openly, influenced labor unions, and managed a smart real estate empire. The scope and length of this operation showed organizational skill of a high order. The Las Vegas skimming operation, while finally leading to his downfall, was also a masterpiece of criminal coordination, managing a plan that involved multiple crime families, many casino workers, complex money movements, and years of successful operation needed planning, discipline, and management abilities that would have been impressive in a legal business context. Aiuppa's ability to rise from driver to boss showed his mix of patience, strategic thinking, and ruthlessness. He understood when to be violent and when to be diplomatic. He knew how to build alliances and when to remove rivals. He kept Tony Accardo's respect and support across decades, which was crucial to his success. These abilities made him an effective criminal leader. But Aiuppa's legacy must also be measured by the destruction he caused. The murders he ordered or approved, at least 13 according to prosecutors, possibly more that were never proven, each represented a human life ended, a family devastated, a story cut short. These were not abstract numbers, but real people with families, friends, hopes, and dreams. Samjiakana, whatever his own crimes, was executed in his own home while cooking dinner. Murdered because he had become inconvenient to the organization. John Rosselli was strangled, shot, and stuffed in a barrel like garbage. Alan Dorfman was gunned down in a parking lot in broad daylight. Tony and Michael Spilatro were beaten to death in a basement and buried in a cornfield. Each of these murders was brutal, and Aiuppa bore responsibility for them, beyond the murders. Aiuppa's criminal operations caused wide harm. The gambling operations he ran destroyed families and lives. Compulsive gamblers who could not pay their debts to outfit bookmakers faced violence, threats, and financial ruin. The corruption he spread weakened democratic institutions, making a mockery of local government in Cicero and elsewhere. The union racketeering stole from working people's pension funds and forced businesses into corrupt arrangements. The social cost of Aiuppa's criminal career is hard to calculate, but undoubtedly big. Every dollar skimmed from Vegas casinos was a dollar stolen from legal owners and from the tax revenue that should have funded public services. Every corrupted official showed a betrayal of public trust. Every act of violence created ripples of trauma that extended far beyond the immediate victim. And so ends the story of Joseph "Joey Doves" Aiuppa, a man who rose from the boxing rings of Chicago to command one of America's most powerful criminal organizations. For nearly 50 years, he moved through the shadows, building empires, ordering deaths, and gathering fortune. From his humble beginnings as the son of Sicilian immigrants in Melrose Park to his position at the top of the Chicago outfit, his journey was marked by strategic brilliance, ruthless practicality, and a willingness to use violence without hesitation. He saw and took part in nearly the entire arc of 20th century American organized crime. From the wild days of Prohibition when Al Capone ruled Chicago through the post-war expansion into Las Vegas and labor, racketeering to the final federal crackdown that brought down the traditional mob structure. He survived when many of his contemporaries were killed or imprisoned. He adapted when others failed to change with the times. He built and kept power through a mix of intelligence, violence, and strategic relationships, but in the end, like so many before him, the law caught up with him. The empire he built fell apart. The organization he led was destroyed by prosecutions and informants. The money he gathered could not buy him freedom or more time. He died at 89, having spent his final years either in prison or as a frail shadow of his former self. His legacy one of corruption, violence, and finally pointlessness. The story of Joey Aiuppa raises deep questions about the nature of power, the price of success achieved through illegal means, and the final pointlessness of a life built on violence and corruption. He achieved everything he set out to achieve in the criminal world: wealth, power, respect, length of life. And yet, what did it all amount to? A criminal conviction, time in prison, a nickname that made him seem ridiculous, and a historical legacy as a violent criminal rather than a respected businessman. What did you think of Joey's story? Do you believe he got what he deserved? Or was he simply a product of his time? Was he basically different from the robber barons and corrupt businessmen who achieved power and wealth through barely legal means? Or was the violence and corruption he represented beyond excuse or explanation? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If you made it this far, you're a true crime legend. You've spent the last several hours immersed in the world of mid-20th century organized crime, following the arc of one man's life from childhood poverty to criminal empire to prison and death. Make sure you're subscribed to this channel. We have countless more stories from the darkest corners of history waiting for you. Hit that like button if you enjoyed this deep dive, and share it with anyone fascinated by the golden age of organized crime. Up next, we have more incredible gangster stories. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and remember, every empire, no matter how powerful, eventually falls. The men who build these empires, who seem invincible in their prime, all face the same final fate: death, prison, or betrayal. The only question is which comes first. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the life of Joey Doves, the silent boss of Chicago. Good night and sweet dreams.